The episode starts quietly. Late at night, Peter comes downstairs to get a glass of water. As he walks into the kitchen, he notices Brian sitting by the window in complete darkness, completely still, like a statue. Peter flips the light on, and Brian slowly turns his head with a slight delay, as if his muscles aren't responding right. Peter asks if everything's okay. Brian smiles a little too widely and says, "Yeah, just listening." "Listening to who?" Peter asks. "The house," Brian replies. The next morning, Brian acts normal, but something is undeniably off. He doesn't answer when spoken to, as if he's busy listening to something inside his own mind. He barely blinks, and when he does, it's slow and unnatural. The fur on his neck is permanently raised, as if sensing something invisible. Lois notices he's been walking around the house at night. Heavy, long footsteps that sound like a much bigger animal. One day, Meg tries to pet Brian, but he jerks back suddenly, and his pupils expand instantly, covering almost the entire eye. For a split second, he looks like he doesn't recognize her at all. Then, in a calm monotone, he says, "I shouldn't. I'm changing." That evening, Brian stops eating regular dog food. Instead, he sits by the refrigerator, listening to the hum of the motor like it's whispering something important. Peter jokes about it, but later that night he hears Brian scratching loudly across the floor, not with paws, but with something long and sharp, like claws. By the next morning, Brian is bigger, much bigger. His chest looks broader, his footsteps heavier. He moves like he's adjusting to new muscles he didn't have before. His eyes shine with a faint glassy glow. Lois suddenly realizes Stewie is missing. His room is empty. No crib, no toys, no trace of him. Only one broken toy on the floor. Panicking, Peter runs to Brian. "Did you see Stewie? Where is he?" Brian lifts his head slowly, and a strange sound escapes him, half laugh, half growl. "He took care of things," Brian says calmly. Peter tears through the house searching for Stewie, calling his name. Brian follows him everywhere, towering over him now, his head nearly brushing the door frames. His movements are slow, controlled, confident, like he already knows Peter won't find anything. At night, Peter checks the basement, hoping for any clue, but it's dark and too quiet. When he turns around, the door shuts by itself. Brian stands at the top of the stairs, massive, almost human tall. His shadow fills the entire doorway. His fur bristles like a mane, and his eyes glow faintly as he speaks. "The house told me," he says gently, "told me what I'm supposed to become." Peter steps back in terror as Brian begins descending the stairs one step at a time. Each one shakes the basement slightly. "You're not Brian," Peter whispers. Brian smiles, his mouth stretching too far. "I'm better." The light flickers, the sound cuts out, the screen goes black. A final post-credits shot appears. It's nighttime in the Griffin living room. An enormous creature, Brian's final form, sits calmly on the couch, breathing slowly. His silhouette is monstrous, but he sits like a person. The house is silent. There is no Peter, no Lois, no Stewie, only Brian, and the sound of his slow, heavy breathing. It all started when Brian became just a little quieter than usual. He stopped cracking jokes, barely argued with Stewie, and didn't complain about anything. At first, the family thought he was just tired, but within a couple of days, they noticed Brian's breathing had changed. Deep, slow, almost like something inside him was shifting. Peter joked it was allergies, but Lois was the first to see the muscles on Brian's back twitch, as if something under his fur was growing. That night, Brian paced around the house for hours, and every step he took sounded heavier, like he'd somehow become bigger. When Peter turned on the lights, Brian slipped into the shadows as if trying to hide. And the next morning, everyone noticed he actually was taller. Not by much, but enough to make everyone uncomfortable. On the third day, Meg disappeared. Peter walked through the whole house calling her name, but But there was no answer. Brian just sat in the kitchen corner, staring at Peter without blinking, as if he knew more than he wanted to admit. Peter asked, "Brian, did you see where Meg went?" Brian slowly turned his head away. On the fourth day, Chris vanished too. His door was open, his bed messy, and his window lifted just slightly. When Peter approached Brian again, the dog didn't even look up. He just let out a long, deep breath. And in that moment, Peter thought Brian's shoulders looked broader, his claws just a little longer than before. On the fifth day, Lois never came down for breakfast. Peter searched every room in panic, calling her name, checking closets, looking outside. Nothing. The house felt too still, too empty, like something underneath it was breathing. He rushed to Brian, yelling, "Where's Lois? What's happening? Why won't you say anything?" But Brian only lifted his eyes that had grown too dark, too deep, reflecting something feral and enormous. By now, Brian took up almost half the kitchen. His chest rose and fell like a massive beast's, and his neck and shoulders were far too large for a normal dog. That night, Peter woke up to heavy footsteps moving slowly through the hallway. He stepped outside his room and saw a massive shadow passing the living room doorway. The shape was vaguely Brian-like, but far taller, almost reaching the ceiling. Peter wanted to call out, but in that moment he realized he was completely alone. Everyone else was gone, and every time he asked Brian about the missing family members, Brian simply stayed silent. On the final night, Peter gathered his courage and approached the living room. Brian was there, fully transformed now, enormous, broad, monstrous, his body rising and falling with slow, thunderous breaths. He sat in the center of the room, staring into the darkness like he was listening to something only he could hear. Peter stood a few feet away and whispered, "Brian, do you understand what you've done?" Brian slowly turned his head, looking straight at Peter with a gaze that had none of the old Brian left in it. The lights flickered. For a split second, the room was swallowed by darkness, and when the lamps came back on, Peter was gone. The house was silent again. Only Brian remained, massive, motionless, staring into the empty living room. And that's where the episode cut to black. This episode didn't start the way Family Guy episodes normally do. There was no intro, no theme music, just a static shot of the Griffin house from what looked like a security camera. Peter was sitting on the couch, staring at a turned-off TV, too still, too straight. The rest of the family stood behind him in a half circle, not moving, not speaking. The first sound in the episode wasn't their voices. It was a warped, reversed audio clip, so quiet it sounded like it came from another tape entirely. After it played, Peter slowly turned to the front door and said, "Lois, we should go outside now." Lois walked to the door, touched the handle, and froze. The door didn't budge. She pulled harder. Nothing. Chris tried slamming into it with his shoulder, but instead of a wooden thud, the sound was hollow, metallic, like he was hitting a steel wall. Peter went to the window, but there was no street outside, no houses, just a blank white fog, perfectly still, like someone forgot to finish drawing the background. "This must be an editing error," Peter muttered, but the tone of his voice was wrong. Empty, like he was reading a line he didn't understand. Stewie noticed another detail. Every clock in the house had stopped at the exact same time. 3:17. Not moving. On the stove, on the microwave, on the phones. Even his own digital watch read 3:17. Meg tried to say something, but no sound came out. Her mouth moved, but the world had no audio for her. Brian barked her name, but suddenly the volume of everything in the house dropped, as if someone was turning down the sliders of reality. The camera shook slightly, like whoever was holding it breathed too hard. Peter returned to the door and said, "It should open. It always opened." He repeated it again and again. Same intonation, same pauses, like an audio clip looping. The house started changing. The kitchen lights flickered off, and when they flicked back on, the chairs were in different positions. Every family photo on the wall had been replaced with identical pictures of an empty room. 3:17 still glowed on every clock. Lois walked into the hallway and came back out of the same doorway she had just entered, even though that wasn't possible. She tried again. Same result. The house had folded in on itself. Brian suddenly noticed movement on the TV. It had turned on by itself. On the screen was a live feed of the Griffin living room, their living room. But the angle was wrong, like it came from somewhere impossibly high. "Peter, look at this," Brian said, but Peter was facing the wall, whispering, "It should open, it should open," in a perfectly looped rhythm. The image on the TV zoomed in. There they were, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Brian, standing exactly where they were standing now. Except their versions on the screen didn't have faces, just smooth surfaces where faces should be. Lois stepped closer to the TV. On the screen, the faceless Lois stepped closer too, but closer than she should have been. A full step closer. The broadcast glitched, zoomed in again. Now the faceless Lois was pressed right up against the imaginary lens. Lois staggered back in fear. The room lights flickered. When they returned, Meg was gone. Nobody reacted to her disappearance, as if she had never been there. Brian rushed to the door and pulled, but the wooden texture of the door felt wrong. Too smooth, too cold. It wasn't wood anymore. It was metal. Lois screamed Stewie's name as he ran into the kitchen and vanished mid-step. The doorway he passed through was now a solid wall. The windows sank into the paint and disappeared. The hallway shortened. Peter stood in the middle of the living room, motionless, repeating 3:17 over and over as his voice degraded into tape hiss. Brian was alone with him. Then the TV turned on again. The same living room. Only one figure now stood inside it. A tall silhouette with no face, no features, just staring. The camera zoomed in slowly, painfully slowly, as if dragged forward frame by frame. Brian looked around. Everyone else was gone. The house had become a perfect square, featureless, exitless. And in the corner of the room stood a tall shadow that hadn't been there before, facing Brian, closer than it should have been. The camera zoomed into its blank face. The screen cut to black. It all started when Brian became quieter than usual. He would sit in the corner of the living room and watch Peter talk, joke, make decisions, lead the family. Peter was always the one in charge. That was normal. But Brian had never really noticed it the way he did now. Every time Peter spoke over him, Brian's ears twitched. Every time Peter announced what everyone would do, Brian's jaw tightened. At first it was just irritation, but then something inside him began to spiral. He stopped sleeping properly. At night he wandered the house, whispering to himself, "I could be in charge. I could lead. I could be the one they listened to." Lois overheard him once in the bathroom, staring at himself in the mirror and muttering, "Why not me? Why never me?" By the third day, his fur had changed, standing up in jagged clumps as if constantly electrified. He looked larger, too. His eyes were darker, deeper. His claws scraped the wooden floor loudly now, even when he tried to walk slowly. When the family asked what was going on, he answered with a strange, calm clarity, a voice too steady to be his. "I'm finally realizing my potential." And he stared at all of them without blinking. One night, Lois woke up to a silence that didn't feel right. She reached beside her. Peter wasn't in the bed. She walked into the living room and froze. Brian was sitting in Peter's recliner, perfectly straight, perfectly confident. He turned to her and said, "He's not the head of the family anymore." Lois demanded to know where Peter was, but Brian only lifted his lips slightly, revealing sharp teeth he didn't have before. The next day, Brian began giving orders. where Lois should clean, what Meg should do, what Chris should turn on or off. His voice had a cold authority that made everyone hesitate. The house grew dimmer. Lights flickered constantly. At night, the sound of Brian's footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy, almost too heavy, like something large was pacing the house. Stewie was the first to piece it together. He'd noticed that Brian frequently came up from the basement, quietly, as if making sure no one followed him. One afternoon, when Brian stepped away to the kitchen, Stewie slipped downstairs. In the far corner, he found Peter, bruised, exhausted, barely conscious. When he saw Stewie, he whispered, "He wants to be in charge. He took everything. He won't let me out." But before Stewie could respond, footsteps began descending the basement stairs, slow, deliberate, powerful. Brian appeared in the doorway, much larger than before, fur spiked in all directions, eyes glowing faintly with a yellowish light. He looked at Stewie, then at Peter, and said quietly, "I'm the head of the family now, and you both stay here." The basement door slammed shut. The lock clicked, and the house returned to silence. The final scene was simple and wrong. The camera slowly panned across the living room. Lois, Meg, and Chris sat perfectly still, as if waiting for instructions. And in Peter's recliner sat Brian, calm, composed, breathing like a creature finally satisfied with its place. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't need to. He had already won. The episode cut to black. It all started the night Stewie heard something moving in his room. He thought it was Brian, but when he turned on his small nightlight, he saw a child standing in the corner. A child who looked almost exactly like him, just a bit taller, a bit paler, with a smile that stayed on his face far too long. The child said, "Hi, brother. I came home." Stewie froze. He didn't have a brother, not one he knew of. But the boy spoke calmly, confidently, as if everything he said made perfect sense. In the morning, Stewie tried to tell Lois, but she brushed it off, though Stewie noticed she wouldn't look him in the eyes. And that evening, the same child was sitting in the kitchen. Lois introduced him as a distant relative who would be staying with them just for a little while. Nobody, not Peter, not Chris, not Meg, not even Brian, remembered anything about him. Yet everyone acted like he'd always been part of the family. Stewie started watching him closely. The brother moved strangely, too smoothly, changing his facial expressions too quickly, like he was selecting them from a menu. He would stand in door frames and stare at people until they noticed him, then walk away without a word. Sometimes he would disappear into a room with no exit, and Stewie would find him moments later in a different part of the house. On the third day, Meg disappeared. Her door was open, her belongings untouched, but she was gone. When Stewie accused the brother, the boy only tilted his head and said, "You'll understand soon, too." Peter became vacant. He would sit on the couch and stare at nothing, like someone had unplugged his thoughts. Chris wandered the house silently, saying nothing to anyone. Lois followed the new child everywhere, moving as if hypnotized. On the fourth day, Chris vanished. Stewie tried to talk to Brian, but Brian walked past him without any recognition at all, like someone had hollowed him out. More and more, the brother appeared behind Stewie even when he locked the door. Some nights, Stewie woke up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, whispering, "We're the same. We belong together." Time stopped making sense. All the clocks froze at the same hour. The windows showed nothing but a flat gray mist. The house wasn't physically locked. It simply wouldn't let them leave. When Lois disappeared, Stewie finally went to the basement, the only place the brother never entered. In the far corner, he found Peter, beaten, exhausted, barely conscious. When he saw Stewie, he whispered, "That thing isn't your brother. It's not a child. It came here because of you." Stewie demanded to know what that meant, but Peter only repeated, "Don't look it in the eyes. Whatever you do, don't look." Footsteps sounded above them, soft, gentle, too controlled. Stewie and Peter turned toward the stairs as the brother began to descend. But with each step, his body seemed to grow slightly taller, slightly more stretched. It started quietly. Joe Swanson stopped showing up at the Drunken Clam. He didn't answer calls. Even Quagmire said he hadn't seen him in days. Peter joked that Joe probably got stuck to his chair again, but deep down he felt a strange, heavy unease. On the third day of Joe's disappearance, someone knocked on the Griffin door. Peter opened it and froze. Joe was standing there, standing on his legs, upright, balanced, as if he had always been able to walk. "Hey, Peter," Joe said softly, almost emotionlessly. Peter stepped back. "Joe, how are you? How are you standing?" Joe tilted his head slightly, like the question confused him. "I've always walked, Peter." His smile was tight, unnatural, stretched just a little too far. Peter told him to leave, but Joe calmly stepped inside the house, walking as smoothly as if gravity didn't affect him the same way it affected everyone else. He talked normally, but every line sounded rehearsed, like someone else was feeding him sentences. By nightfall, Peter was gone. The house was unnervingly silent, and in Peter's favorite armchair sat Joe, holding the TV remote as if he had been doing it for years. Lois acted like nothing was wrong. The kids didn't question it. When they said, "Dad," they were looking at Joe. Only Brian reacted, the only one who remembered Peter existed. The next day, Brian confronted him. "Where's Peter?" he demanded. Joe stared at him for an uncomfortably long time without blinking. "Peter's here," he finally said. "I'm Peter." His tone was so calm, so confident, it made Brian's stomach twist. That night, Brian heard footsteps. Not Peter's, not Joe's. Something heavier, slower, echoing in multiple parts of the house at once. He rushed to the living room. Joe was still there, sitting upright, watching the static-filled TV. But his shadow on the wall was wrong. Too tall, too stretched, too alive. On the fourth day, Brian went to the basement. He followed faint drag marks carved into the wooden floor. The air down there felt colder than it should, thick like fog you couldn't see but could feel in your lungs. In the far corner, Brian found a torn piece of a green shirt, Peter's shirt. And then he heard a weak groan, unmistakably Peter's. Brian stepped forward, but before he could follow the sound, the basement door slammed upstairs. "Peter!" he called, but the voice that answered was not Peter's. Joe was standing in the doorway, still, too still, taller than before. Or maybe the ceiling had somehow lowered. His face didn't move, but he was smiling. "You've learned too much, Brian," he said, voice almost echoing. Brian tried to run, but Joe's steps were unnaturally steady, too smooth for a man who used to rely on a wheelchair his entire life. When Joe grabbed him, Brian felt an icy, metallic grip, like the hands weren't made of flesh anymore. "I'm Peter," Joe whispered, "and I'm staying." The final shot of the episode was the Griffin living room. Lois cooked dinner as if nothing had changed. Meg and Chris watched TV, and sitting in Peter's armchair was Joe, perfectly still, perfectly composed, wearing Peter's calm expression like a mask. No sign of Brian anywhere, just his collar lying in the shadow near the couch. The episode cut to black without sound. It all started so suddenly. One morning, Peter woke up in an unbelievably good mood. Not just cheerful, unnaturally cheerful. He smiled wider than usual, spoke in a soft, polite tone, cleaned the breakfast dishes without being asked, and complimented everyone for the smallest things. Even Lois admitted she liked this new Peter. He asked Chris about his day. He helped Meg pack for school and told her she deserved to feel appreciated. He picked Stewie up and hugged him, gently, evenly, a little too long. The family adored him. No one questioned it. Only Brian watched him carefully, though he didn't say anything. Day by day, Peter became increasingly perfect. He anticipated everyone's needs before they spoke. He timed breakfast perfectly, cleaned the house top to bottom, never raised his voice, never argued, never complained. But the strangest part was that his smile never left his face. Even when he thought no one was looking, his expression remained fixed, stretched, smooth, almost glued in place. One night, Lois woke up and saw Peter standing in the hallway with his back toward her. Completely still, completely silent. When she asked what he was doing, he turned his head far too slowly and said, "Just watching over the family, making sure everyone is safe." By the third day, the house itself began to react to him. Lights flickered whenever he walked past. The TV turned on the moment he sat in his recliner. Sometimes his shadow stretched strangely across the wall, taller, sharper. But whenever Lois blinked, it snapped back to normal. The kids didn't notice any of it. They said, "Dad's just better now." But Lois couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was too good, too controlled. One afternoon, she went down to the basement to find an old box, despite Peter telling her more than once, "Please don't go down there yet. I'm fixing something." The basement door was cracked open. She stepped inside. The single bulb hummed weakly overhead, and in the far corner, slumped against the wall, was Peter, the real Peter. Dirty, exhausted, wrists tied, shirt torn. He lifted his head slowly and whispered, "Lois, that thing upstairs isn't me. Please don't trust him." Lois stumbled toward him, trembling, when she heard footsteps above her, slow, steady, confident. The basement lights sputtered. Then the false Peter appeared at the top of the stairs, the perfect one, the smiling one. His expression didn't change at all. His eyes reflected the basement bulb like polished glass. "Lois," he said softly, "there's no need to worry. I'm the better version." She shielded the real Peter with her body. She tried to ask who, or what, he was, but nothing came out. The false Peter took one step down, then another. His smile stretched slightly wider, past the point where a normal face should move. "You both stay here," he said calmly. "The family needs someone who does everything right." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked from the outside. Lois pounded on it, screaming, but the house did not respond. The lights flickered, then went out. The final shot of the episode was the living room. The kids sat quietly beside the new Peter. He gently patted Meg's head, straightened Chris's collar, and held Stewie on his knee. They smiled. They leaned into him. They accepted him. Nobody asked why their father no longer blinked. Nobody noticed that he never once stopped smiling. The episode cut to black.